Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. When the Book of Mormon was first published, most people believed that it talked about the Native Americans in North and South America. This is known as the hemispheric model. However, modern scholars have tried to limit it to a very small area known as the limited geography theory. Heartland experts believe the Book of Mormon took place in North America. So which one is right? Jonathan Neville will explain why he thinks the limited geography theory is wrong and why Heartland theory is more accurate to the Book of Mormon. You won't want to miss this episode. Check it out. Well, so that brings up another issue that I want to talk about then. So even if we're going to say the Panhandle of Florida is where you're saying that Lehi landed, John Sorensen, and I think pretty much Baja and South America, Chile, and even Malay all agreed that it was a limited geography of, I want to say 150 square miles or something.
Right.
A very small area. Whereas if you're going from Florida to New York, that's 2,000 miles. I don't know. I mean, it's not. It's a much larger area.
Okay, but you're talking about different segments of areas. One of the key things, I had three kind of epiphanies or realizations about this whole thing. Number one was people travel on rivers. Ancient people always travel on rivers. And you can travel a lot farther on a river than you can through a jungle, right? So I understand Sorensen's argument that in one day they could only go so far, or in a week, or the different time frames that they had.
And he bases this on like Greek and Roman armies and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I'm fine with all that. I don't have any disagreement. Like I said, the facts that they bring up I don't have a problem with. But they just overlook river travel completely. And that's partly because there's not many rivers in Central America. There's the two rivers and that's about it. If you look at North America and the rivers, the ancient people all used the rivers. And you could travel long distances. That's why at Zell's Mound is a good example. Joseph Smith said that Zell for Onondaga, depending on how you interpret it, was known from the Rocky Mountains to the Hill Cumorah. And when they did the archaeology there, the archaeologists in Illinois excavated that site. They found artifacts from the Rocky Mountains to the east. Now, there isn't a specific artifact for the Hill Cumorah in there, but there is artifacts from, Ohio up to western New York area, right in there, and also all the way down to the Gulf Coast. And this dates to Book of Mormon time periods. It was dated between 300 and 400 AD, as I recall, Zell's Mound, the ones they excavated.
Because it doesn't talk a lot about river travel in the Book of Mormon, does it?
What did Mormon say? He had a specific section where he says, I'm not talking about our building of ships and all our shipping. He specifically said, I didn't even get into all that, right?
Well, I mean, the thoughts that come to my mind are like the people of Limhi that were in bondage to the Lamanites, and then they traveled in the woods or the jungles or whatever it was, and people got lost. I mean, it sounds like, if you've been to rainforest, it would be really easy. Even like Belize or Lamanai or whatever. It's amazing the growth there, and it would be really easy to become lost. But there's not talking about a lot about rivers.
Yeah, okay.
They're not traveling on rivers. They're traveling on foot.
Great point. I love that point. But I've been in the jungles. I've been down in Peru, and I'm in the jungles. You can follow trails pretty easy, especially if it's only a few days old, because as you hack through there, you can't just walk through there. You have to hack your way through, right? And Limhi and his people, and Alma and his people, they had a lot of people. Well, Limhi, we don't know for sure. But let's say he had 20 or 30, But when Alma left, he had a lot of people.
Yeah.
I'm talking about Limhi's explorers, not Limhi's people.
Oh, okay.
He had 24 explorers.
Oh, okay.
But when Alma left, he had a whole bunch of people with him, right? If you couldn't follow that trail through a jungle, you couldn't. You could do it in the dark, because they would have had to hack their way through the whole jungle. And they had animals with them and all this stuff. So the idea, this has always been a puzzle to me, or it was until I knew the Heartland. How could the Lamanites not follow him? When I've been down there with machetes in the jungle, you have to hack your way through. So they would have had a very obvious trail to follow, and yet the Lamanites lost them. So either the Lamanites were really stupid, or they weren't going through a jungle. And this is what I pointed out in one of my books, is that when you're on a river and there's all these branches of rivers, within 1 or 2 turns, you have no idea where the people could have gone. And that's the nature of rivers. And even if you're going downstream, it's a little easier because all the rivers are feeding one. But if the person you're following goes upstream one way, you'll never find them, right? And so
how do you go upstream without a engine?
You have a boat, you have a paddle. What do you mean?
Well, it doesn't. It seems like, I mean, because I know in your book you talk a little bit about the Mississippi River and some of those things. Mm-hmm. I don't know how anybody's going upstream up the Mississippi.
They do it all the time. It's a very slow-moving river. Now, the thing is, you have to not think of it in terms of it is today because of all the dams and locks and all that. But when you look at it historically, Lewis and Clark went all the way up the Missouri River in canoes, I mean, explorers, Native Americans did that all the time. That's how they got all around. That's how all the tribes interacted. That's how Zelf's Mound is located on the edge of the Illinois River. And the artifacts came all the way from the Rocky Mountains and from the Gulf Coast. To get there from the Gulf Coast, they had to go up the Mississippi River, right? And to get there from the Rocky Mountains, they came down the Arkansas River or the Missouri River. But in order to trade, they had to take stuff back, right? So going up and down the rivers is no big deal. And that's how it has been historically, at least in Zelf's time, Zelf's time frame. And when you go to the mounds and the areas, even in Georgia, they have stuff from Michigan. And upper Michigan Peninsula, where the copper came from, that's spread throughout the whole western or eastern United States.
So you're rejecting the limited geography and saying that the Book of Mormon people were river travelers.
Yeah,
and so that they could go a lot farther.
And it is still a limited geography compared to the hemispheric model.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and that's where I have to tell you, and in my book Mormonize America, I dedicated it to John Sorensen, Jack Welch, Rod Meldrum, and Wayne May, because those are the 4 most influential people in this whole thing, in my opinion. And it's because I really appreciate John Sorensen because he made the Book of Mormon real to me. He said, these are real people, they're not imaginary, and there's actual archaeology to show it. And he made us think in terms of what were the people really living like, right? And unfortunately, he focused on the Mayans, which don't have any connection to the Book of Mormon. But when you take what Sorensen started with, and then you combine it with what Wayne and Rod have developed in terms of looking at Ohio archaeology. I mean, it's called the Ohio History Connection, where they report all the latest discoveries in Ohio and archaeology and stuff, and I read all that stuff. And it's really exciting, because now, to me, that's Book of Mormon people. And you can understand the woven cloth that they had and the pearls that they had. They excavate pearls in these mounds in the hundreds, things like that. So it just makes it much more real. And the idea of traveling on rivers is so obvious that why would they even have to talk about it? The Book of Mormon never says they breathed oxygen, but we assume they did, right? And that's why I find it really interesting that Mormon made that point, that I haven't even talked about our building of ships and shipping.
So, because I will bring up one more thing. Okay, so let's go back here. So Lehi lands in the Panhandle of Florida.
Well, okay, let me mention something about that. Anywhere in Florida is good. In fact, some say the oldest Hopewell site is north of Tampa, Florida. And that's a perfectly legitimate landing, too. I mean, it could be anywhere along there. I know up in Palmyra, this is anecdotal, but I was told that they had an artifact that had an alligator engraved on it, a wooden artifact. And one of the local tribes came into the museum where it was on display and said, "Where'd you guys get that?" He said, "That's our symbol." And the guy asked him, "Well, why would an alligator be your symbol?" He says, "Because that's the first animal we saw when we arrived," which is in Florida, right? Mm-hmm. And if you look at the history of the Hopewell, there's archaeologists debate about who was first and all that, but the earliest settlements appear to have been in Florida of that tradition. And so whether it's the Panhandle, I chose the Panhandle just because it kind of fit with the rivers that they would have gone on to go up to Georgia and Tennessee.
Okay.
But even if they had landed in Tampa, they'd gone up that way. I mean,
Okay. So So you're saying that they landed in the Panhandle of Florida,
Okay.
Pensacola or whatever,
Right.
and then there's a river there that goes up through Georgia.
The Flint River.
The Flint River, thank you. And so
There's actually more than one. Some people think it was a different river. I think the Flint River because it was known among Native Americans as a source of flint. And Nephi said that his brothers' hearts were like flint. And to me, that's an analogy that he would have made because he was in an area where there was flint.
okay.
So,
Okay, and I guess it's important to make a distinction. While you and Wayne May and Rod Meldrum are all Heartlanders, you all have kind of different takes
totally. Yep.
on there. And so there can be differences in details.
Totally.
But okay, so at any rate, so with what
Right.
you're going with, Panhandle, they go up the Flint River, up through Tennessee. How long would it have taken them to get up to... we've got the land southward, the land northward.
Okay.
I mean, they're eventually going to get to
Yeah.
New York. And
Right.
so we're spreading out, and this is
good.
a couple thousand miles, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing that I want to mention is New York is very snowy. Ohio is snowy.
Right.
There's no snow ever mentioned in the
Yeah.
Book of Mormon. And so I know that Sorensen has said this has got to be a tropical land because there's no snow.
Okay. Let me answer that
Wouldn't they
one
have talked
first.
about that?
Let me address that one first.
Okay.
I was leading a tour in Turkey of Travels of Paul. We woke up one morning and it was a blizzard. You could hardly see anything. And I was like, what the heck? The Bible didn't say Paul traveled in snow, so this could not be the travels of Paul. What are we doing here? You see the analogy?
Okay.
Bible doesn't, the Book of Acts never mentions snow. So how could it have taken place in Turkey? That's what the argument that Book of Mormon doesn't mention snow, so it couldn't have taken place in North America. The point is that neither the New Testament nor the Book of Mormon talks much about the weather at all. And so whether there was snow or not, it never became an issue. And so it's kind of like saying, I don't know how to make it any clearer. Nephi did use snow as a metaphor, so which would have been meaningless to his people if they weren't familiar with snow, right?
He did? I don't remember that.
Yeah, he says, white as snow.
Well, that's how he's quoting Isaiah there.
Well, you could say he's alluding to Isaiah. It wasn't a quotation.
Okay.
But it was still, he's talking about the driven snow. I don't think Isaiah talked about the driven snow. But, and then the argument would be, well, Nephi, I'm never saying Nephi was up in New York, but in Chattanooga, they do get snow, so they get driven snow. And this is not just a light dusting on top of a mountain and on a volcano in Central America. Driven snow means you know what it's like to have snow driven, right? So you're in the snowstorm. So Nephi, at least for Nephi and whoever he was writing to, understood what driven snow was. Now his descendants wouldn't have known about snow in Jerusalem, because it does snow in Jerusalem too sometimes. But it had to be driven snow. That's how I look at it. But to me, it's a total red herring to talk about the snow thing, because it applies just as much to the New Testament. So, I mean, how do you argue against a red herring? You just have to say, well, what is your premise? That if they didn't talk about snow, they didn't experience snow? If that's your
if the
premise,
Indians are running around in a loincloth.
well, but it also said they wore thick clothing. So at one point they had thick clothing, other times they just had a loincloth. If you've lived in New York, you know that's how it is. In the summer it gets really hot, and in the winter it gets really cold. So in the winter you wear thick clothing, in the summer we wish we could wear a loincloth. Well, you wear t-shirts and jeans, or shorts.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to me that's totally normal. I don't even see how that's an issue, and yet people ask me a lot because they've been conditioned by the M2C guys to think that's an issue, but it's a fake issue. If that was a real argument, then the travels of Paul are false too.
Well, let me throw one more thing at you then, because I know reading Sorensen, at the time of Christ's appearance in the Americas, we'll say, the Third Nephi talks about mists of darkness,
right.
And the Meso people say, hey, that sounds like volcanic activity.
Yeah.
We've got volcanoes in Central America. We don't have volcanoes in New York or Ohio, really.
Yeah. So you know where else we don't have volcanoes? in the Book of Mormon. I mean,
it doesn't explicitly mention.
It doesn't mention volcanoes.
But it talks about the mist of darkness.
Okay, I'll get to the mist of darkness.
Okay.
But think about that. Their argument is it doesn't mention snow, so it couldn't happen in New York where there's snow. But it doesn't mention volcanoes, but they insist there had to be volcanoes. So those two arguments are completely inconsistent with each other. Either they're going to say if it doesn't mention it, it didn't exist, in the case of snow and volcanoes. Or if they're going to say it doesn't mention volcanoes, but they had to be there, then they have to say, well, it doesn't mention snow, so they could have had snow too. You see what I'm saying?
Okay.
So as far as the mist of darkness and the upheaval of the land and the cities being buried and all that stuff, every single thing the Book of Mormon talks about has actually happened in American history at the New Madrid Fault in Missouri. They had a massive earthquake of 1811 and 1812, I think. And the earthquake was so disruptive that it rang church bells in Massachusetts, allegedly.
From Missouri.
From Missouri.
Wow.
And it's still the largest fault in the United States today. If you look at the fault charts, we always talk about California and even here in Utah. But the one in New Madrid, Missouri is still the biggest in terms of seismological potential. And so the people who were living there in 1811 and 1812 recorded what they experienced. And one of the things they experienced was they couldn't light fires because of this darkness of this mist. What happens is it creates these sand blasts, or there's a term for it, I don't remember, but it upheavals sand and dirt from these earthquakes.
Like the Dust Bowl kind of a thing?
Yeah, something like that. Well, the Dust Bowl's a whirlwind, and they had whirlwinds too. Mm-hmm. But sand, someone would tell me what that is, but it's a sand thing that just basically erupts, the sand erupts. And it causes all this dirt and debris in the air, and they couldn't see, it was dark, they couldn't light fires, just like it talks about that mist. The Mississippi River was turned so much that it ran upstream, for a while. It changed the course of the river, it flooded places and uncovered others and created new rivers. All these events that it talks about in 3rd Nephi, you can document line by line with the actual accounts. This isn't just theoretical or archaeology. This is actual people who were living there in 1811, 1812 that talk about it. And you can see exactly what it is. So the only question is, was there such an earthquake around, 30, 35 AD? And you can get a variety of opinions about that because they have to do core samples and see if there is an upheaval or not. But as an example of this, the power of the Mississippi River, the original capital of Illinois was Kaskaskia. And it was the largest city in Illinois. It was, as I recall, it was settled by the French, but it became the largest city in Illinois. It was the state capital. And they had a flood from the Mississippi River, changed the course, washed out the entire town, and now Kaskaskia is on the other side of the river. It's not even in Illinois anymore. But you may have seen some of the depictions of the Mississippi. It looks like spaghetti where they go through and see how it's changed course so much. But it has totally inundated and washed out entire towns and cities we think of in modern terms. But Kaskaskia would have been a city in the early 1800s. Are you familiar with the steamboat Arabia? Have you heard about that?
I'm not sure.
This is just a little anecdote, but it gives you an idea of how much the earth can change along these river systems in the Midwest. There was a steamboat called Arabia. It was going up the Missouri River. It went up the Mississippi, then the Missouri. And it had actually taken some of the saints coming to Utah before, but on this occasion it hit a snag in the river and sunk. And it sunk so fast that all the people were able to get off, but they left all their supplies, and they had whiskey and all kinds of hats and coats and dinnerware, all that stuff in the ship. It just sunk. And so I'm thinking it was in the 80s or so, some adventurers thought they wanted to dig it up because they could get the treasure out of there. And so they went up and down the river looking with their sonar, trying to find this ship. It had sunk, I think, in the 1860s. And some farmer stopped and said, "What are you guys doing?" And they said, "We're looking for this ship that sunk." And he says, "Well, when I bought this land, the old boy told me that there was a ship underneath my farm, buried under there." And so they said, "Well, where?" And he showed them it was about a half mile away from the river, which is pretty far.
Yeah.
And they took their equipment over and they started digging where he told them. And the whole time they're doing the probes to see if they can find it, and they hit some big metal object down there. And so they kept digging, and as I recall, they went down about 60 feet and they found the ship. And it was intact.
Now buried under land.
Yeah, buried under land. They dug the whole thing out. They had to get pumps to pump the groundwater out and all that. And now it's in a museum in Kansas City, and you can go through and see the original ship as well as all the. It's an amazing display of all the stuff that was on the ship, from the clothes and the silverware and jewelry, all that stuff. But the point is that was only about 100 years before they uncovered it, and it had shifted a half a mile underneath 60 feet of farmland, been farmed for decades.
Wow.
So when we think about these events in 3rd Nephi, where the cities were buried and lost forever, that's what happens along the Mississippi River. And if they could still be there for all we know, but they would be really deep and they would be really far away from the existing river. So that's why, the 3rd Nephi event, to me, I can understand why they would say it's a volcano. But it seems to me that if it was a volcano, they would have said it was a volcano. And they didn't. What they described was flooding, whirlwinds, tempests, and the earthquake, of course. Mm-hmm. And that is, to a T, what happened in New Madrid. That was in 1812, 1813.
Okay.
1811, 1812. But there's been other earthquakes. And if you look on there still, on the earthquake maps, you can see other earthquakes in that area. And every so often now they still have tremors in that area. But it fits the Book of Mormon, I think, better than the volcano explanation does. Never mentions lava in there, in the Book of Mormon. Mm-hmm. And that was always kind of one of those puzzles in the back of my mind. Okay, they lived in Central America for 1,000 years, never mentioned volcanoes, never had eruptions, Okay, well, maybe like snow, they just didn't mention it. But when Rod basically told me about this, the New Madrid fault, and I've been there now, and been to the museum and seen all this for myself, it's amazing. It's such a perfect fit in my mind. It even explains why the land southward wasn't as affected as the land northward. And we might be getting too much in the weeds now, but I mean, seriously, every little detail that I've seen as an objection, there's an awesome answer in the Heartland.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jonathan Neville. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about Florida. It's kind of a narrow neck of land. Could that be where the Book of Mormon took place?
I've seen that
to
too.
Florida.
Yeah,
although I don't think anybody's come up with a serious.
I could in 5 minutes. I could. No, I'm serious. I did a blog post once where I said, look, I challenge anybody to show me any part of the world that I can't define as Book of Mormon lands using the text, because the text is vague.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe to patreon.com/gospeltangents for just $5 a month. Patreon is spelled patreon.com/gospeltangents. If you'd like to watch the entire video, you can subscribe at YouTube, Patreon, or on my website at gospeltangents.com and click the yellow subscribe button for just $8 a month. PDF transcripts are just $10 a month, and you can get those on patreon.com/gospeltangents or on my website. I'll send those to you as soon as I've finished completing it. If you'd like to get a paperback and PDF, just subscribe for $20 a month at either Patreon or on my website. Individual paperbacks are available at Amazon.com. Just do a search for Gospel Tangents Interview, and you can find all of our past interviews there. Show your Gospel Tangents pride by purchasing a t-shirt on our website at gospeltangents.com/shop. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. You can get our latest updates by friending me at Facebook, or you can also follow our page at facebook.com/gospeltangents. Become an insider and you can see the newest videos. Follow us on Twitter at Gospel Tangents. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some of our great videos. Thanks again.